Hello everybody, and today we'll be looking at the Game Boy games that will soon be added to the Nintendo Switch library, from The Legend of Zelda to F-Zero. If you're only interested in a particular game, I'll leave the timestamps on now. Kirby Tilt and Tumble is a top-down view Kirby game in which Kirby takes the characteristics of a ball or marble, similar to that of the Marble franchise. What separates it, however, is that it is controlled by the movement of the Game Boy, or more specifically, the built-in gyro sensor of the game cartridge. The game also allows Kirby to perform a form of jump by flicking up the Game Boy. In this game, Kirby must tilt and tumble himself through 8 separate levels, each of which have 4 stages, with their own environments and obstacles, like bumpers, holes, balloons, clouds, and even rivers, as well as the enemies from the more traditional Kirby games. The biggest obstacle within the game is simply just falling off the edge, and then listening to Kirby falling and then suddenly exploding. At the end of each level you'll also find a boss, which are... hang on, let me check through my list here. No. Here it is. We're not entirely sure why the Kirby creators have a thing against one-eyed creatures, but they appear again in the form of observers. And like every other villain in the Nintendo franchise, their weakness is their big, round eye, which Kirby must jump on to do damage to them. If Kirby also manages to pick up a blue star before completing a level, he'll be rewarded with a set of mini-games. Pokemon the Trading Card Game is the Game Boy version of the Pokemon Trading Card Game. The game follows the story of Mark, or whatever you decide to name the character, who has the ambition of becoming the world's greatest Pokemon trading card game player. To do so, they have to defeat the 8 Club Masters, and then go on to face the Elite Four, or I should say the 4 Grand Masters. For any of you who never learn how to play the Pokemon trading card game like me, there's no need to worry, as the game goes through the basic instructions with a tutorial. After choosing your starter deck, which are all based off the Gen 1 starter Pokemon Charmander, Bulbasaur and Squirtle, the player sets off on their journey, alongside their rival, Ronald. The player is able to edit their decks at any time, and collect more cards by defeating trainers, in which they give you 2 packs from a particular set. Those sets being Colosseum, Evolution, Mystery and Laboratory. I personally started off with the Charmander set and then later moved on to a Psychic/Ghost deck. Sadly, explaining how you play the game would take too long, but the in-game introduction is actually quite useful. Although some thought will have to go into your deck, as some of the opponents are quite difficult. You can also receive cards from Dr. Mason via his emails/messages he sends the character after certain events. If I had to describe the game, I would compare it to a mix of Yu-Gi-Oh, but simpler, Pokemon, and a game in which you flip a coin, as a large amount of the moves involve some form of coin flip. In between fights with the Club Masters, the player can also compete in the Challenge Cup, which follows a tournament system where the winner will receive a promotional card. And now the game you've all been waiting for, or at least one of the games you've been waiting for, which also has quite a long opening cutscene, but luckily we can just speed that up. Anyway, The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons, which is the counterpart to, obviously, The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. The game starts with Link being teleported to the world of Holodrum by the Triforce. Once there, Link meets Din the dancer, and after some short conversations and dancing, a sudden storm arrives. This is when we meet General Onox. He then goes on to reveal to us that Din is the Oracle of Seasons, hence the title of the game. He then proceeds to throw Link around like some form of ragdoll. After beating up Link, he then goes on to kidnap Din, and then imprison her, causing the seasons of Holodrum to go out of whack. Luckily, early on, Link acquires a Rod of Seasons, which allows him to change the seasons, from winter, summer, spring and fall, all of which have an impact on the area around him, varying from freezing water, creating vines, and so on. Although Link won't start off with all the seasons within the rod. Link is also aided by 3 animal companions which you can ride, although you can only choose one. I'd personally recommend Moosh, the flying bear. Like every other Zelda game, the game also features equipment for Link to collect and use. My favourite example being the magnetic gloves, which allows Link to repel and attract other magnetic objects. The game also obviously features the typical dungeons and bosses you would expect in a Zelda game. However, underneath the land of Holodrum you'll also find a land of Subrosia, in which Subrosians live, a lava-like hell location with its own currency and culture. Comparing this game to its counterpart, Oracle of Ages, this game has a higher focus on combat, while Oracle of Ages has a focus on puzzles. Speaking of Oracle of Ages, our next game is Oracle of Ages. The game starts off similar to that of Oracle of Seasons, but instead Link is transported to the world of Labrina, or at least that's how I think you pronounce it. Link then goes on to meet Nehru, who's singing in the forest. Shortly after meeting, however, both are attacked by Varan, who later goes on to possess Nehru, who, surprise surprise, turns out to be the Oracle of Ages. This of course messes with the time in Labrina. The reason I'm telling you this before it actually happens is because this intro section takes around 3 minutes, so instead we'll just skip ahead to the important parts. During his journey, Link also obtains the Harp of Ages, which, just like Oracle of Seasons, allows him to temporarily correct the problems within Labrina. In this case it allows him to go back in time, rather similar to Ocarina of Time, although this time it's back in time and not forwards in time. The game also has many of the features present in Oracle of Seasons, like the rideable mounts, the dungeons, new pieces of equipment, and so on. Although as mentioned earlier, the game has a slight more focus on puzzles rather than fighting, whether the puzzles be dancing with some Gorons, or just pulling a few pull things. One thing I have neglected to mention though is the use of a linked game. After completing Oracle of Seasons or Oracle of Ages, you are given a password which you can enter into the opposite game. Doing so will allow Link to carry over some of his upgrades. It also acts as a continuation for the story, with many characters reappearing in the opposite world despite normally not being there in an unlinked game. Finishing a game that's been linked will also add a final dungeon to the game as well as a final boss, and will also allow you to carry over your rings, which is something I've also neglected to mention. To very briefly explain what magic rings are, they are rings which Link can equip that have various effects, most of them positive, some of them negative. This can include increasing the amount of damage he does with a sword, a boomerang, or increasing the amount of damage he takes, being able to breathe underwater, preventing Link from sliding on ice, and so on. The next game we'll be going through is Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. The game starts with Kirby being split into 4 by some sort of evil Meta Knight. This is where the multiplayer aspect comes in, as obviously you can have other players play as the other Kirbys. Playing on your own, however, they just run around and do whatever they want. After reaching the end of the first stage, we get to watch this evil Meta Knight and Meta Knight fight, which results in the loss for Meta Knight, which I'm getting fed up of saying now. After he's sealed within the mirror and then cut up, the shards of the mirror fly away, and we catch a glimpse of a evil looking Kirby, or we can only assume it's evil anyway. From then onwards, the game takes a somewhat Metroidvania style, with there being multiple directions or stages you can go into, making the game less linear than your average Kirby game. The game also features new power-ups, like Mini Kirby, while also featuring the classic staples like Fighter. The game also happens to feature bosses, some of which are reminiscent of previous bosses from the games but slightly different. After defeating the bosses, Kirby is rewarded with a mirror shard, which he must complete in order to save Meta Knight and the rest of the mirror world. The next game we'll be looking at, F-Zero Maximum Velocity, is uniquely the only game in the F-Zero franchise not to feature everybody's favourite racer, Captain Falcon. The game features 4 different machines to use, with extras being unlocked later on, as well as 3 separate sets of tracks, and 3 difficulties. When starting a race, you may notice a map in the bottom left, which seems like a silly thing to point out. However, in this game, you have to prepare for the upcoming turns, as this isn't one of those racing games where you just hold down the accelerator and fly around the course. You actually do have to brake. The vehicles within the game also feel rather slidey, which makes sense as they're floating / hovering. This does lead to an element where you feel like you're out of control, which actually makes the game quite exciting, while also making it feel quite rewarding when you don't smash into 8 walls and 3 other drivers. The machines also allow the driver to strafe left to right, as well as boost, so long as they have a boost available, which you're given every time you finish a lap. Although you have to be careful where you use it, otherwise it can have some negative consequences. And if you take too much damage, your vehicle will end up moving incredibly slowly. And if you take more damage after that, let's just say it doesn't end well. The next game on the list is one that I'd never previously heard of, but does seem to have a cult following. The game being Golden Sun. The game starts with our protagonist Isaac sleeping in, while we hear strange rumblings outside. The rumblings turn out to be a large amount of boulders, which are going to fall onto the village. We also get to catch a glimpse of some telekinesis, which is a part of the magic of the game which they call synergy. After finally leaving the house, Isaac and his friend Garrett head to safety, only to find a group of townspeople holding one of the boulders back. We then get a look at the combat, which works just like any other turn-based RPG. Anyway, to cut the intro short, Isaac and his friends go to save some villagers. Sadly, things don't go as planned. The game then cuts to 3 years later, where the characters are more or less adults, both of them being already well versed in Psy-energy, or Synergy, I can't remember. They then decide, along with their teacher, to travel up to the mountain, which seems to be some sort of sacred temple. This is where we see one of the more unusual aspects of the game, which is that the characters have the ability to use some of their magic outside of combat to change the environment around them. Starting off with the ability to push or pull objects, allowing us to complete various puzzles within the temple. We then learn about 4 magic star items which will be important later on. However, 2 villains come along and take 3 of the stars, as well as kidnapping 2 of the characters' friends. Then the whole magical world they're in starts to crumble down, and a weird looking eye blob thing saves them and teleports them away. Sorry I can't explain this very well, but I don't want to spoil anything for you, and the start of the game happens to be really wordy and difficult to explain. But to explain the game very briefly, it's a Japanese turn-based RPG with some puzzle elements thrown in. And we finally get to the last game, Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade, or just Fire Emblem, as it's known everywhere else in the world with the exception of Japan. The story follows our mute protagonist, who is a tactician, who is rescued by a woman named Lynn. The game then goes through its fairly long-winded tutorial, then progresses and still goes through small tutorials during each level, as well as having new characters join. The game has a focus on using strategy, and using the environment around you for your advantage. For example, characters on wooded spaces and mountains are much harder to attack, And swords are more effective against axes, axes are more effective against spears or lancers, and lancers/spears are more effective on swords. Another key feature, and something you have to look out for, is your characters dying or being knocked out. This means that in further stages they won't be available. Thankfully, characters knocked out in the first half of the game can be used later on in the second half, as the first half is used as a form of practice/tutorial. And that's the end of the video. We're not entirely sure when Nintendo will actually be releasing these games, but hopefully it'll be fairly soon. What I'd like to know is, which of these games do you intend to play? And are they games you've played when you were younger, or games that you may have missed out on? Thanks for watching.